We all live under rules. Parents impose rules on children, teachers impose rules on students, employers on employees, and government on everyone. But every rule elicits unintended consequences. An example every student has experienced is a page requirement. A teacher gives you a writing assignment and says you must write at least 10 pages. Maybe you use a larger font and wider margins. You use long quotes, flowery prose, and irrelevant detail. Your character no longer runs to the store. He perambulates to the commercial establishment with alacrity and determination. This video will cover 4 examples. 3 times when government action had disastrous unintended consequences in the past, and 1 where it might in the future. Unintended consequence number 1. FDR's policy to fight inflation ultimately resulted in our current problems with health insurance and pre-existing conditions. When Barack Obama ran for president, he promised to put an end to insurance companies refusing people coverage because of pre-existing conditions. Most people receive health insurance through their employers. If a person becomes sick and can't work, the person loses his job. But because his insurance comes through his employer, the person also loses his health insurance. And when the person tries to obtain new health insurance, the new insurer refuses to cover the person because the person is already sick. This sounds like a problem that the government should solve, but it turns out it's a problem the government created. As the US sent millions of people overseas to fight in World War II, a labor shortage developed at home. The labor shortage drove wages up. As wages rose, they drove up the prices of goods and services. The result was rapidly accelerating inflation. Throughout 1940, inflation was almost zero. By July of 1941, inflation had risen to 5%. 3 months later, it had risen to 10%. By May of 1942, inflation was 13%. In an attempt to slow the inflation, FDR asked Congress for the authority to impose wage controls. In response, Congress passed the Stabilization Act of 1942. The Stabilization Act gave the president the power to fix prices, wages, and salaries. Acting on this authority, in April of 1943, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9328. This prohibited employers from increasing wages or salaries. Employers started offering health insurance. Why? One way employers compete for workers is to offer higher wages. But Executive Order 9328 prohibited this. How could employers attract workers if they couldn't offer higher wages? One way was to offer workers something else they might want that isn't wages. Health insurance is one such thing. Prior to 1943, the poor and working classes often belonged to mutual aid societies, private institutions that provided health care in exchange for a membership fee. Now, to attract workers, employers offered to pay for workers' health insurance. But even after the wage controls ended, employer-provided health insurance continued. Why? Because Congress declared the benefit non-taxable. Preferential tax treatment of employer-paid benefits caused workers to prefer receiving their health insurance through their employers. Health insurance companies work by taking in money from people who are well and paying out money for people who are sick. If people could purchase insurance only when they were sick, they could benefit from the insurance without having to pay for it. But the insurance companies would quickly go bankrupt. To prevent this, insurance companies refused to cover pre-existing conditions. But the need for insurance companies to protect themselves against pre-existing conditions, combined with employer-provided health insurance, created the 4th unintended consequence. Workers who became so ill that they lost their jobs became uninsurable. The unintended consequence of entering World War II was inflation. The government responded to the inflation with wage controls. The unintended consequence of wage controls was to cause people to obtain health insurance through their employers. The unintended consequence of people obtaining health insurance through their employers is the pre-existing condition problem. Fast forward to the 21st century, politicians gave us the Affordable Care Act in part to solve the pre-existing condition problem. But in trying to address pre-existing conditions, politicians asked the wrong question. Instead of asking what government could do to solve the problem, they should have asked, what did government do to cause the problem?
If Professor Davies' ideas and passion inspire you, and if you'd like to meet him in person, join Students for Liberty at LibertyCon International in Washington, D.C. Visit www.libertycon.com for details. Link in the description.
Unintended consequence number 2. Mexico City's air pollution laws caused an increase in air pollution. To reduce air pollution from cars, Mexico City's politicians told people they could only drive their cars 4 days a week. But the law caused air pollution from cars to rise. How? If you need to get to work on a Monday and you aren't allowed to drive your car, what might you do? You might walk, or take public transportation, or carpool with someone who is allowed to drive on Mondays. This is what lawmakers intended. But what about people who can't or don't want to do any of those things, but still need to get to work on Mondays? Many took taxis, but taxis in Mexico City tended to be older and to emit more pollution than did the typical car. Some people bought second cars that, with different license plates, they could drive on the days they weren't permitted to drive their regular cars. Of course, people who bought second cars only to drive them 1 day a week tended to buy cheaper cars. And cheaper cars tend to be older, often less well-maintained, and to emit more pollution than the typical car. One unintended consequence of the law intended to reduce air pollution was to cause people to drive their cleaner cars less and to take less clean taxis and drive less clean cars instead. The result was that the detrimental effects of people using less clean transportation options outweighed the beneficial effects of people taking public transportation, walking, or carpooling. Consequently, air pollution from cars not only didn't decline, it rose. Unintended consequence number 3. African countries that banned trade in ivory saw their elephant populations diminish, while those that didn't saw elephant populations increase. In Africa, poachers kill elephants to obtain their tusks, which they sell. Over decades, poaching has decimated Africa's elephant herds. To protect the populations of wild elephants, in 1990, many countries banned the buying and selling of ivory. The reasoning was that in making it illegal to trade in ivory, there will be less incentive for poachers to kill elephants, and so the elephant populations will recover. What's interesting is what happened to the elephant populations in 2 African countries, Kenya and Zimbabwe, in the decades before and after the ivory ban. The 2 countries took very different approaches to dealing with poaching. In 1979, there were around 65,000 elephants in Kenya. Most of the elephants lived on game preserves. Kenya banned both the hunting of elephants and trade in elephant products, hides, meat, and of course, ivory. Also in 1979, there were around 30,000 elephants in Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe not only did not ban elephant hunting, Zimbabwe promoted it. It allowed controlled hunting on state-owned land and allowed trade in elephant products. Zimbabwe even raised money for its Department of National Parks and Wildlife Management through the selling of ivory and elephant hides. And starting in 1975, Zimbabwe allowed private landowners to hunt elephants on their own land. Given these very different laws, one would expect that Zimbabwe's elephant population would have been decimated while Kenya's thrived. But over the decade from 1979 to 1989, the opposite happened. Kenya's elephant population dropped from 65,000 to 19,000, while Zimbabwe's grew from 30,000 to 45,000. The reason? Unintended consequences. Although Kenya outlawed elephant hunting and the trade in elephant products, people still wanted ivory. The possibility of incarceration made it more expensive for poachers to poach, but it was still profitable. In fact, possibly more profitable as the ban reduced the supply of ivory, thereby driving up ivory's price. At the same time, the ban made it unprofitable for ranchers to raise elephants. Outlawing the trade in ivory didn't eliminate poachers' profit incentive to kill elephants, but it did eliminate ranchers' profit incentive to raise elephants. Because Zimbabwe allowed both elephant hunting and the trade in elephant products, ranchers and landowners still had a profit incentive to raise and protect elephants. They would sell safari rights to rich hunters, requiring the hunters only to hunt the old and sick elephants. The sale of safari rights brought in revenue that ranchers and landowners used to raise, care for, and protect the elephants. Compared to Zimbabwe, Kenya's laws intended to protect elephant herds had the unintended consequence of harming them. Potential unintended consequence number 4. Student loan forgiveness will cause an increase in low market value majors. In an attempt to alleviate financial burdens on young people, politicians have proposed forgiving student loans, meaning that student borrowers won't make promised loan payments to the federal government. To make up for the lost revenue, the federal government will either have to raise taxes or cut spending. So one unintended consequence of student loan forgiveness will be that people who didn't go to college will pay for those who did, either by paying higher taxes or receiving fewer government services. Another unintended consequence is that the quality of higher education will decline. If high school students expect that their future college loans will be forgiven, many high school students who are not prepared to go to college will now be more likely to go to college. Maybe to roll the dice on getting a degree, maybe as a 4-year paid vacation, or maybe because they haven't yet figured out what they want to do with their lives. For all these reasons, many students will want to enroll in college who otherwise would not have. And this is excellent news for colleges because it greatly increases the market of potential students. But to keep those students and their tuition dollars, colleges will have to make it easier for those students to remain in college. That means reducing the academic rigor of their courses, which naturally will make degrees less prestigious. Also, because the students who are choosing whether to go to college aren't the ones who are paying the tuition, colleges will have a strong incentive to raise tuition so as to capture more revenues. The dual unintended consequences of student loan forgiveness will be to make a college degree both less valuable and more expensive. We've covered 3 examples of unintended consequences and hypothesized about a 4th. We could go on to think about the unintended consequences of all kinds of proposals made by politicians, teachers, parents, anyone who imposes rules on others. But it's the broader, more general lesson that's most important. Every rule, no matter how well thought out and well-intentioned, comes with unintended consequences. To enact effective rules, we must be extremely careful to anticipate the unintended consequences that will arise and to soberly weigh them against the rule's intentions.